Good afternoon and good evening for those of you who are not in our hemisphere. I want to welcome you to ISSOP's continuing webinar series on the impact of global climate change on children. My name is Jeff Goldhagen. I'm a pediatrician here in Jacksonville, Florida with the University of Florida and am president of the International Society for Social Pediatrics. For those of you who are aware of what our organization has done, we thank you for your continuing support. For those of you who are just being introduced to our organization, we are the only global organization focused on the social determinants of health from a global perspective in the context of social pediatrics. For those of you who have been with us in the previous webinars, we want to welcome you back. And for those of you who are new, we want to welcome you to our series. The previous sessions, of which there's been 5, are all on our YouTube channel, which is ISSOP.org. And I would welcome you all to visit our website, www.issop.org. There you can find information about the previous sessions, as well as a significant amount of other material that relates to climate change, not the least of which is our declaration. So with that, then I want to get started and introduce our presenters for today. For those of you, again, who have been here with us previously, you will know that we will be presenting 2 presentations by Dr. Fiona Godlee and Dr. Richard Jackson, after which we will open the floor for question and answers. And then after that, we'll be breaking up into breakout sessions that are framed in the context of the different regions of the world. And we welcome you to pick one of those regional breakout sessions. Actually, we more than welcome, we urge you to join us in those breakout sessions, because that's where the dialogue and discourse really happens. Our presentations will be recorded and presented during the first part of the session, and then our Q&A session will be live, and our speakers will be available to answer your questions. Again, we want to thank you for participating with us. Thank Miguel Perez for his support through for the IT, and also Eva Goldhagen for her support for making this and the previous sessions so successful. So without further ado, let me introduce the 2 speakers. The first speaker will be Dr. Fiona Godlee. Dr. Godlee is world-renowned, in particular because she is the editor of BMJ. And in that role, she's made a very significant contribution to medical knowledge. But more so than that, also the BMJ has made a significant contribution to addressing global issues of social significance, including now climate change during this crisis that we're experiencing. She's a member of innumerable boards and has many honorable degrees, but her primary contribution to the world really has been her expertise and her vision and her leadership with respect to the BMJ. And for that, we want to thank you, Dr. Godlee. Our second speaker today is Dr. Richard Jackson. I'm a little bit embarrassed that I haven't known Richard in the past. He is a pediatrician and a faculty member at University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. But Dr. Jackson, Dr. Jackson has made a most significant contribution in his work related to the impact of the built environment and urban environments on children and adults and communities. It's interesting that Dr. Jackson has many awards from from medicine, American medicine, American pediatrics, and so on. But he also has many awards from architectural environments and architectural institutions. And so in that context, he blends both pediatrics and architecture to focus on the urban environment and ways that communities can come together to improve the environment. So with no further ado, let me again thank Drs. Godlee and Drs. Jackson for their participation. Thank you for being with us. I urge you to continue your work in the area of climate change. We welcome you to continue and sustain our work. Together, our voice can be far more amplified than it is individually. And I also welcome you to please consider joining ISSOP as we move forward to address climate change. And thank you, and I'll turn this over now to Miguel, who will begin the session.
Hello, I'm very delighted to be making this presentation to you. And let me just first of all share my screen. So I've been asked to talk about the role of medical journals in the climate emergency, and also hopefully I will give you some thoughts on the role of clinicians in addressing and tackling climate change. Just briefly to run through things you all know, that the world is getting hotter, and it's getting dramatically hotter, not just the hottest year ever, but the hottest 10 and more years ever in recent years. And just in case you needed reminding of what that actually means in practice, we have the global temperature change that has been happening since 1850. Which is heading inexorably towards the dreaded 1.5 degrees centigrade over and above pre-industrial levels. And this is an inexorable move. And we must also remind ourselves that 1.5 degrees centigrade is not a safe temperature increase over industrial levels, but that's the one that we are trying to keep within. Global CO2 emissions rapidly rising, unaffected by major world events, Spanish flu, the Great Depression, the two world wars, the oil shocks, the Soviet Union collapse, the financial crash. And I think we are beginning to realize also the COVID emergency will have made very little impact, as it turns out, on our global CO2 emissions. If we're going to keep temperature rises below this 1.5 degrees C, we're going to have to go for dramatic changes in emissions. As you all know, carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere a very, very long time. So emissions that are being released now will be there for many years to come. We have to make radical change if we're not to overshoot that 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is going to lead to catastrophic climate change. We know what's fueling the climate crisis and also air pollution. We know that high carbon living damages health in many, many ways. And we know that it also damages health in more general ways with floods, extreme weather events, droughts, war, and refugee crises around the world. It is a tricky thing, though, to change our behaviour. And I borrowed this slide from a presentation at the Eden Project, where I'm a trustee. And just to talk about what we can do as individuals and as society to try to change things. Buckminster Fuller, the renowned architect, said quite clearly, our task is predominantly metaphysical, for it is how to get all of humanity to educate itself swiftly enough to generate spontaneous social behaviours that would avoid extinction. And then Sir Ken Robinson more recently, this rather wonderful but devastating quote, "It's often said that we have to save the planet. I'm not so sure. The Earth has been around for almost 5 billion years, and it has another 5 billion years to run before it crashes into the sun. As far as we know, modern human beings like us emerged less than 200,000 years ago. If you imagine the whole history of the Earth as 1 year, we showed up at less than 1 minute to midnight on December 31st. The danger is not to the planet, but to the conditions of our own survival on it. The Earth may well conclude that it tried humanity and is not impressed. Bacteria are much less trouble which may be why they've survived for billions of years. And then Greta Thunberg, act like your house is on fire, because it is. So why do we need the health voice? The environmentalists have been shouting about this for some time. And health, I think, as we can see, has been rather slower to pick up on this. But we do need the health voice. They need the health voice. And these are some reasons why, when talking to environmentalists, they say they need us. They need us because the climate emergency is harming human health. It directly affects patients and the public, and that's our business. We know that low carbon living can improve health. So this is a matter for public health through better air, better water, safer roads, all of those things that we know cause damage to human health, better diets, more active transport. Because healthcare is a major carbon emitter. Overall healthcare around the world is thought to produce 1/5 of the world's carbon. And we've really got to get our own house in order. And we need the health voice because health professionals are a trusted messenger at a time when there are very few people whose word is really, really, really trusted by the public. So what can medical journals do? Well, this was my list. I think what we have to do is to make it mainstream. We have to show that this is the business, the core business of health professionals and researchers, that climate emergency is not something for other people. And I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. We need to tell the truth, and we need to keep telling it. That's what Extinction Rebellion around the world has tried to do. And that's what we need to take up the cudgel of, to tell the truth. We need to advocate for action. And one way to do this is to convene with other people, to partner with people, and to support those doing good things. We need to hold people's feet to the fire. We need to monitor what they're doing and keep pressing them to do more. We need to offer practical steps for people so they can feel that they can act on this. And as a medical journal, we can publish and publish and publish and don't stop publishing. We need to just keep the pressure up. Overall, I think a real difficult balance for us is to promote honesty and hope over denial and despair. It's all too easy for us to push this to one side because it's just too difficult. Honesty and hope are the only routes by which we're going to really make a difference. It's important, I think, to remember where we've come from. And you'll have seen this slide, I'm sure, in previous talks, which I think is a wonderful example of how denialism and despair can cause us all to just give up. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Well, my own journey on this began when I was sent in 1992 by Richard Smith, the then editor of the BMJ. I was a young editor on the journal, and I was sent to the Rio Earth Summit. And I wrote a diary about that. And I think it really was a visit that changed my life and led also on to a book that I co-wrote through the BMJ with Alison Walker on the health and the environment, with a chapter in it on the implications of climatic change. And this was in 1992. So we've been at this a long time in the journal. You could argue this is a sign of failure rather than success, because it has been such a long time since we've been talking about these things. Making it mainstream, that first thing that I said journals can do, has been the result of a great deal of work of colleagues, Richard Smith, Ian Roberts, Anthony Costello, Robin Stott, Hugh Montgomery, David Pension. These are 6 people who have really inspired and helped and supported me on my journey, and have helped the BMJ, and also in many of their cases have acted very closely with the Lancet as well to try to press that message home, making it mainstream, making it the core of everyone's business in healthcare, and not something just for a few mad activists. Back in 2006, just after I became editor, I published this Editor's Choice, which was linked to a number of articles we were publishing on climate change. What did you do about climate change, Mum? And I announced in that editorial, Editor's Choice, that we were launching, at Ian Roberts' suggestion, a Climate and Health Council. That's what we're going to call a Carbon Council, to advise the BMJ on how we could actually make a difference here. I didn't think this was a terribly controversial thing to do, but the responses to it were in some cases extremely heated and vindictive even about the BMJ and why we were taking on climate change. And this is just one example of that from a surgeon who says, in my view, it is indeed that if there is no preventive treatment, surgery or medication, nor any possible palliation, then it falls outside my area of interest. I stand by my criticism of BMJ, which I have made privately for a long time. The journal is supposedly a medical publication. Now, an asteroid strike would have some pretty serious consequences for public health, but I don't expect a lapsed doctor, that's me, to write editorials about the possibility, seeing it as a topic for astrophysical journals and thereafter for general public interest and discussion. Of course, I may yet find a whole issue of the BMJ devoted to asteroids, meteors and comets and their potential effects on human health, but I don't think it would be a worthwhile exercise. The job of a medical journal is to disseminate research and information about medicine. And that's just one example of several really trying to put us back in our box. But we did go ahead and launch what became the Climate and Health Council, which was a group of experts and active people wanting to make a difference, which advised the BMJ and which brought in the Lancet and other groups to really try to make a difference, to magnify the health voice. And we continued then to do what I've said, the second thing on our list, after trying to make it mainstream, to tell the truth. And here's an article published in 2012 by Tony McMichael and colleagues, it just really pressing in on the health risks, present and future, from global climate change. And Tony's been an absolutely fantastic person, keeping on telling the truth as we need to hear it. The Lancet has done a fantastic job with its Lancet Countdown and this important statement, which has been taken up by many others. Climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And when the Lancet says that, people will really listen and have really listened. And here we have Cristiana Figueres, chair of the Lancet's Countdown, talking about tackling climate change directly, unequivocally, and immediately improves global health. It's as simple as that. And this call was taken up by WHO, Margaret Chan, the then WHO Director General, saying the evidence is overwhelming, climate change endangers human health, solutions exist, and we need to act decisively to change this trajectory. And again, that very helpful and important quote, climate change is the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. And that's a very, very strong statement. And it had to be something that was backed up by evidence and came from a trusted source. From the Climate and Health Council, we further convened, if that's another thing that we can do, make it mainstream, tell the truth, advocate for action, and convene and partner and support. And this is has been an important group in the UK, pulling together a really all of the major health organisations in the UK, all the big Royal Colleges, including the Royal College of Nursing, the Lancet, the BMJ, the BMA, other societies. And overall, because of these member organisations having their members representing 700,000 or more health professionals in the UK. And this is to magnify the health voice and really show that we can speak as one on this important issue. And Richard Smith, who was my predecessor at the BMJ, is the chair of the Alliance now, and is a wonderful writer and advocate, and has written a number of blogs, one of which is this, where he talks about what we as individuals and organisations can do to tackle climate change. Holding people's feet to the fire, one of those groups are the financiers and the commercial experts around the world. And it's very important under those circumstances to know that the bankers are very much in favour of divestment from fossil fuels. They see fossil fuel investment as no longer worth investing in, and that really advising people to move their money over into sustainable energy. And we've been working, again, keeping on the pressure about the importance of climate action in the era of COVID, with trying to build climate action into recovery plans. And this article, which talks about what can be done as a result of phasing out fossil fuels, that this could avert about 3.6 million premature deaths a year related to air pollution alone. And that global action required to meet the 1.5 degree target is estimated to deliver an economic benefit of up to $610 trillion by 21,000. And that comes from an article in Nature Communications. becoming, I think you could say, more strident, if that's not a pejorative word, but more confident in the calls we've been making since those early days back in 2006. Now in 2020, the health case for urgent action on climate change, just saying that health professions have a leading role and calling on health professionals around the world to step up and really act on this crucial responsibility. This was to launch a collection of articles we published on health in the Anthropocene, which, as you can imagine, is about this current era of the human species, which is driven by the human activity impacting on our environment. And then a specific call to action. This is about practical steps, but also that business about holding feet to the fire. Investing in humanity, the BMJ's divestment campaign, health professionals and medical organisations must act now. And this is to divest from fossil fuels. What do we mean by divestment for health? We've explained it in simple terms there, and also how to do it. So this is really trying to give people practical steps for how they or their organisations can divest from fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy. And a key initiative that has now happened in the UK is that the NHS, which is one of the world's largest employers and is a huge contribution to carbon emissions in the UK, has introduced this very, very ambitious programme to become net zero, led by Nick Watts, who used to be the director of the Health Alliance. So these things all come around supporting each other and building capacity in expertise and in networks that can be mutually beneficial. So the net zero NHS begins with understanding what that footprint is and then dissecting it down and seeing what actions one can take. And so here is one slide from that report, which looks at the sources of carbon emissions by proportion of NHS carbon footprint. So this is all the different things that contribute to the NHS's carbon footprint, and that you'll see that a large part of it is about the medical equipment and supply chain. And so that's a tough one to act on, except that the NHS has enormous buying power and really can put pressure on its suppliers, which can then have a knock-on effect to those suppliers in other sectors. So this is a really ambitious programme and one that has government commitment behind it. And this is just to show what individual elements are going to need to be tackled if we're going to bring those historic emissions down to the target, which is to become net zero by 2044, 2050. And you'll see that we're talking about decarbonising the electricity, decarbonising vehicles, the changing in care pathways, ensuring there's preventive medicine to reduce hospital use, reducing anaesthetic gases. I'll talk a bit more about that. Travel to and from care, and then buildings and energy, food waste, suppliers, and then substituting low carbon alternatives for products. So there's a vast amount of effort that's going to need to go into this across a whole range of different sectors. And this was the thing about the anaesthetic gases. You'll be aware of this, but this just simply by switching to environmentally friendly inhalers and stopping anaesthetic gases, this is going to bring a really substantial reduction in CO2 emissions in the NHS and likewise across healthcare around the world if these could be adopted. Another organisation to give a shout out about from the UK again is the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. And this is a small organisation, but it's having quite a big impact because it's providing really practical support for clinicians to reduce their carbon footprint. And you'll see that what we have at the moment is this picture of high levels of chronic disease with unsustainable resource use and low value interventions. So a lot of people being driven through into high carbon emitting secondary care. They're saying that we can reduce the carbon by 30% simply by using lower carbon alternatives within the existing model of healthcare. But that the really big wins of 80% carbon reduction can be achieved by changing the way in which we think about health prevention, patient-centered care, and leaner pathways. So this is redesigning healthcare to keep people out of healthcare, keep them in primary care where possible, and away from very carbon-heavy secondary care. And they've got a number of sustainable specialties where they're growing actual practical advice for people so that they can work together, redesigning their pathways and sharing knowledge and tools. So if you want to go to their website, you may well find some very useful tips. So finally, what can you do as an individual within your organization? Some of these things you will already be doing: becoming informed while you're joining in these webinars, sharing information, getting involved in how your organization is responding to the climate crisis, get your organization to disinvest from fossil fuels or to declare a climate emergency, review your own clinical pathways and waste management, and lead by personal example. I just want to give a shout out for this particular organization. I only heard about them the other day. They're called Aim High. And I think the reason I'm particularly impressed with this is they run courses which really do help to move people away from denial and despair into hope and action. And there are courses for individuals, there are courses for teachers if you're involved in trying to teach other people. And then there's leadership training for executives and teams. It's a not-for-profit. They do ask a small donation for joining the courses, but I really would recommend you go to Aim High and see if there's something there for you, because one of the real challenges, especially for the young, is feeling utterly overwhelmed by this. And what we need to do is to help people see themselves as activists, because that will not only improve their quality of life, but actually could help to make a difference for the world. Thank you very much. I really would welcome email from you if you want to contact me or my colleagues at the BMJ. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Well, I say hello to you all, and I'm Dr. Richard Jackson. I'm a retired professor at UCLA Fielding School of Public Health, a pediatrician, a long career in environmental public health. I'll be talking about two events or stories that relate to the importance of pediatricians to change the agenda in environmental public health, including issues like climate. And so my background and contact information is there, and I'm going to just go forward here. I began my medical school training in 1969 and was doing a rotation in New York City and went on the ward with the attending, very young, and I saw about 10 to 12 very young children, some toddlers, some preschoolers, running very intensively and hectically around the ward. And I said, yeah, they look fine. Why are they here? And he said, well, they're being chelated for lead poisoning. Chemicals were being put in their blood to pull out the lead from their bodies. And the attending physician took me to a back room, and here was a baby in the crib convulsing and in coma. Eventually she died. And she had a blood lead in the hundreds. She had been in a home that was had lead paint, maybe had some other sources of lead, and that was the source of it. And over again, we blamed lead poisoning, at least the landlords did, on negligent mothers. And you can see the peeling paint, that was lead paint that was used for 40, 50 years. And typical childhood behavior, a toddler was to go along and begin to chew on the windowsill. And if they happen to be iron deficiency or calcium deficient, they're even more likely to try and do that because it's a divalent cation and it filled a need for more calcium and iron. Not only were our children getting lead from paint, they were getting it from pipes. And some of you may have heard the story about Flint, Michigan, where they stopped buffering the water going into the homes. And if the water's too acidic, it pulls out the lead from the pipes and from the solder in the connections in the pipes. Not only were our children getting lead from those sources, they were also getting it from canned food products. And you can imagine if an acidic thing like pineapple slices were put in a metal can, it would leach the lead out of the solder on the ends of the can. It was also very commonly used in evaporated milk, which was a combination used with water to feed babies who couldn't breastfeed and required milk supplementation. But not only was lead in those sources, it was also in gasoline. This happened about a generation after lead was introduced in all those other uses, but the lead, tetraethyl lead, improved the compression of gasoline and made cheaper quality gasoline more efficient. But look how much lead was just in a gallon, 2.5 grams. It meant that if you filled your tank with 12 gallons of gasoline, you added the equivalent of a 1-ounce fishing sinker. And it wasn't just lead bars or something else. It was highly bioavailable because the lead was being spewed out of the exhaust pipes as atoms of lead and pervasive in the environment. So the quantities of lead that were being used throughout our states was enormous, in the range of kilotons per million persons per year by state. After World War II, America decided the way that we could deal with getting people around, this was a lesson from the war, would be to put in high-speed roadways. And the largest public works project of the 20th century was the interstate highway system in the United States. This is exactly what the automotive industry wanted, because people began to move out of the cities. They needed cars. They were commuting longer and longer distances. The gasoline industry liked this just great. Of course, the concrete and steel industry and cement industries were very supportive as well. And developers outside of cities had a chance to sell relatively inexpensive farmland for lower levels. All this lead in the environment, we knew for really since the Australian work around the turn of the last century, that children who were lead poisoned would have a tough time. But we thought when they got better, they wouldn't have residua from it. My friend Herb Needleman was seeing more and more children in his pediatric psychiatry neurology practice, and he was seeing middle school, high school students with behavioral and other problems who had been lead poisoned as children. And so he did a study looking at reaction times. A light would turn from green to red and the children would be expected to react quickly. What he found was children who had been lead poisoning had poorer reaction times than children who had not. This led to a really groundbreaking study, really a landmark in children's environmental health. His study looking at the shed teeth. Children, of course, shed their baby teeth between about ages 5, 6, and 7, and they would analyze the lead in that teeth. And it was important because the lead that was left in the tooth was a reflection of how much lead was in their bodies as young infants. In fact, the children could have the same blood lead, but the teeth were telling us what was going on years before. They analyzed the teeth for lead, but then they also interviewed teachers and other adults about the children's behavior and functioning. And the reports, obviously the people being interviewed didn't know the lead level on that child. The teachers were reporting that the more lead in the child, that the children were having lower overall functioning, and those children were the ones that had higher lead levels in their teeth as infants. This was groundbreaking, and there are a couple of big lessons that came out of it. One is that there's a window of susceptibility, of vulnerability, particularly that first year of life where the sensory, vision, and hearing are developing, but also language development. The brain is forming many synaptic connections, actually 10 times more than eventually needs. But that chance to build all those synapses begins to abate by about age 1, 1.5. And as the higher cognitive functioning comes in place. But so children have windows of vulnerability, and the damage done can be long-term. The other big lesson, and this goes to work that I and many other pediatricians did and others around pesticides in the diets of infants and children, in the past, all the regulations were done on the basis of how much an adult ate, a 70-kilogram adult sitting on a couch or going to an office, and yet a child was eating 2, 3, 4 times as much food and drinking as much. And behaviors, of course, were different. A toddler on a hot day running around the house and minimal clothing and on the floor putting their fingers in their mouth was getting much more exposure than the fully dressed adult sitting on the couch. And so children were getting more exposed and during much more vulnerable windows. It meant we needed to set much more stringent environmental standards. The activism of the pediatricians and other health folks led to the decline of lead in paint. That green zigzag line was lead in paint from about 1900 to 1970. It was pretty much phased out by 1970. But in that blue line is the arrival of gasoline and leads. Really began to accelerate after 1950. The Americans' embrace of the automobile in a powerful way. And the quantities of lead that were being put into the atmosphere were enormous. But it was very difficult to get rid of lead in gasoline. The most powerful industry in the United States, the petroleum industry, didn't want anyone changing that. But something else was going on in the environmental world. Environment links to health, and that was smog. And the poster child for smog in the United States was Los Angeles, a beautiful city with a wonderful climate, but surrounded by mountains that created a soup bowl of pollutants that were coming out of car exhaust, and the nitrates of oxygen were producing the smog, and also very high levels of lead in the atmosphere of places Los Angeles, and ozone levels. One of the reasons California has more stringent air standards was this, but also California devised, the California Air Resources Board invented the catalytic converter, which could get rid of the oxides of nitrogen and reduce ozone levels dramatically. And these catalytic converters were expensive. It had precious metals in them. So you did not want to damage them, and using leaded gasoline would destroy them. So California quickly moved to requiring only unleaded gasoline in its automobiles. And that spread from California by the mid-1970s to the entire United States by about 1990. Back when I was seeing children with lead poisoning, my blood lead level was about 22 micrograms per deciliter. Look what's happened in the United States. This is a very powerful data sample, including physical exams, lab tests of 5,000 or so Americans a year. And you can see with the phase out of lead in various sources, particularly the phase out from gasoline, blood leads dropped dramatically. And that means that children's brains began to work better. And so one of the projects I did when I was at CDC, and partly because I had to appear in front of Congress all the time and say, we need to get rid of lead and gasoline and these other sources. And I'd be told, oh, that's too expensive. We don't want to spend the money. So we calculated the cost of lead polluting the brains of very young infants. And by the way, it's associated with the decline in IQ lifetime. And by getting rid of lead in the brain, you're bringing about a lifetime gift of about 5 IQ points per child, which converts to about $213 billion each year's cohort of children get. IQ is biased in its own way, but it's a pretty good predictor of how long you stay in school and your lifetime income. And so it was these economic arguments that really moved it as well, again, based on children. And I did presentations for the Ministry of Health in China when they visited CDC, and I was the lead for Vice President Gore in Russia on climate and health. I'm sorry, on environment and health. And this is when we did the blood leads on the Russian minister and the vice president, and showing that lead levels were lower where the leading had been removed from gasoline. I went back to CDC in 1994, became head of the National Center for Environmental Health. Here I am being sworn in by one of my heroes, Dr. David Satcher. He was the director then, he went on to be Surgeon General in the United States. And he was extremely supportive of efforts to improve the quality of life of children, particularly from environmental threats. And that includes infectious disease environmental threats. David grew up in Anniston, Alabama. At age 4, he developed whooping cough. He was one of a large group of children. He could not be admitted to the hospital because he was a Black child. And his mother stayed and cared for him night and day for 7 days, got him through that. So when Dr. Satcher understood that asthma levels were higher in poor children, he really stepped up and began to work very, very hard with us on that. The same was true for nutrition and many of the issues of disadvantaged children in the United States. But I learned a bunch of lessons moving to Atlanta, and one of which was the schools were all built on remote land, and you were expected to own a car and you were expected to haul your children back and forth, particularly if they stayed late. And some schools had school buses. But you can see on the bottom left, schools similar to the ones my sons went to, there were no sidewalks. It literally required you to have a car. If you were poor, if you were disabled, if you were blind, complete disadvantage of getting adequate schooling in that setting. Other thing that we were doing about the commitment to more and more cars as the people moved out, we ended up taking some of the finest farmland in the world. This area had 60 to 80 feet of topsoil and converting it into housing, which meant that we docs help people tell people to, eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, eat fresh, eat local, and yet we were destroying all the local agricultural land where that could occur. And one of the best ways to reduce climate heating is by having a robust and healthy forest population, tree population. About 1/7 of all the CO2 increase has been related to deforestation. And because of the needs of cars, the United States paved over 60,000 square miles of our landscape. And you can look at that bottom left picture of a parking lot for a shopping center. By the way, there's far too much parking for how much real need there is. It bakes in the sun, gets hot, increases these ozone and oxides of nitrogen levels because of the heat and the sunlight. And also when it rains, the pollutants that have landed on that parking lot go right into the aquifers and streams and rivers. This is just documentation. The hotter it gets, the more ozone in the air. Ozone is bad for you. It triggers asthma and other illnesses, and hastens the conversion to more irritating air issues. It also increases your risk of death. And in 1995, I was there about a year, and we got a call from Chicago, and freezer trucks were lining up outside the coroner's office. And this is the first real documentation of a heat wave killing people. And we learned a bunch of lessons, one of which is homes with very poor ventilation, with very poor people, no air conditioning, and people afraid to even open their windows were at the greatest risk of heat stress. And by the way, lack of trees, lack of vegetation greatly increases these risks. And thinking that cars will fix all our problems, sitting in an air-conditioned car and in stop-and-go traffic, listening to music or talking on your phone may seem like a good idea, but driving, particularly in stressful situations, raises your risk of a heart attack. Your cholesterol level, your adrenaline level, your cortisol levels all go up. And that risk, slight risk, but it lasts for about an hour after you finish driving. And driving is, of course, the major cause of the third or fourth leading cause of death in my country, which is cars hitting, particularly pedestrians. And the faster the car is going, the more likely the pedestrian is to get killed. And so I was the lead for Built Environment and Health for the UCLA campus, and we worked very hard, and we did succeed in putting in a requirement of a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit on campus. It upset a bunch of people, but the death rate is only about 5% only if a pedestrian's hit compared to a car going 30 miles an hour, which is over 40% death rate. So by changing car behavior, we were changing health. There's another contributor to adverse health effects of sitting around too much and not exercising, and you can see that in the obesity epidemic. Here's the obesity epidemic in 1990. The state of Georgia was about 10 to 14% obese. By 2000, Georgia was up to over 20% obese. And by 2019, it was up to almost 30% obese. And this is same kind of numbers have appeared in much of Latin America, much of Europe. I don't know enough data about Europe, Asia, but the obesity epidemic is worldwide. Yes, it's about how much we consume, but it is also about how physically we active are. We can mitigate the risks if we are physically active, and yet sitting in the car all the time is not going to help us mitigate those risks. As the BMIs go up, the body mass index goes up, your risk of diabetes goes up as well. It goes up more for women, that's the green line, than it does for men. But they're quite dramatic increases for your risks of type 2 diabetes, my risks, as my weight index goes up. So, of course, the diabetes rates in my country have gone up dramatically. Georgia was showing about a 5% rate back in 1995. By 2003, it was a bit higher, but you can see the other states beginning to have much higher rates. And by last year, you can see that Georgia is up to close to 15%. So about a third of all of Americans are obese, another third fit in the category of overweight. And this is unfortunately a way that America is leading the world, and things that I'm very sad about. We all should be sad about. But I never predicted as a young pediatrician, when I was seeing children in the diabetes clinic, I never saw a child with type 2 diabetes. And now it's half the kids in the clinic, the diabetes clinic, have what we used to call adult onset diabetes. And diabetes reduces your lifespan in the range of 9 to 10 years, increases your medical costs dramatically. So this is not a casual threat. So what does this all have to do with climate? And where I'm going with this is I became really obsessed with climate during my time at CDC. My children were born in the early 1980s. They've never lived in a colder than average year. My grandchildren were born after about 2015, and they have lived in the hottest years ever on record. So we're seeing major changes in the worldwide climate. The southwestern United States is in a terrible drought, and it could last for generations. It's going to have major impacts on our cities. The energy in the atmosphere has increased because of more heat, and the moisture in the atmosphere and the violence of the storms has increased at the same time as a result of climate heating. Here is NASA's map, NOAA's map, using satellite data of heat levels for the past year compared with a baseline of 1980 to 2010. And you can see where it's gotten hotter. The boreal areas of Siberia, for example, extremely hotter heat waves over 100 degrees, which is mind-boggling. But I'm going to point out, I don't have much time here, the blue spot to the south and east of Greenland. Why is that there? Well, Greenland, this immense ice sheet, more than a mile thick, is now covered with water a good part of the summer, meltwater, which is seeping down the moulins and down to the rock base of Greenland, and then moving underneath and accelerating glacier movement across and off of Greenland into the North Atlantic. Since the year 2002, using satellite gravitational work, NOAA's been able to estimate how much water is being lost from Greenland. This is just one location. This is beyond the Himalayas, beyond Antarctica, beyond the Arctic itself. And just for Greenland, it's about 280 gigatons a year. And this is fresh, clear water that's been ice for 100,000 years. I didn't really know what a gigaton was. I knew a TONNE is a metric ton, and which is about 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. That weighs a metric ton. A gigaton is 8 billion tons. And so there is a schematic of Manhattan, and you can see the equivalent of 3 gigatons of this beautiful ice water sitting on top, and that's what's being lost, but it's 280 times that per year times 20 years. So the quantity of ice being lost and the change to the oceans has been dramatic, and it's one of the reasons we need to get reduce the CO2 and reduce the melting and reduce the heating in the atmosphere. I went around giving a lot of talks in the southern United States, and I got nowhere with those arguments. And I finally began to realize that Americans are so resistant to the idea of doing something about climate. I had to cast it in a way that really mattered to their lives. Wildfires have become very real, particularly in California and Western United States lives, because it has completely changed how our lives are going. I began to argue that we need to rebuild our communities, and in terms of housing, in terms of street, in terms of transportation, in terms of walkability. Wrote this first piece in the early 2000s on why we need to rethink the building of the environment. We knew this 100 years ago, but then we forgot when everybody got in cars. I had some difficulty. I was accused of being guilty of junk science. I was accused by the home building industry, saying, of course, suburban people live longer than urban people. Of course, they didn't take into account the demographics. With Howard Frumkin, who was then at Emory and now at the University of Washington, we did our first book on urban sprawl and public health, and why really building is as important for health as the toxics, the recycling, and the other issues that we think about, sunscreens and the rest. A bit slow, but we finally got the leadership, medical leadership in the United States, in this case, the Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academy of Medicine. Their recommendations on how do we deal with the obesity epidemic was, number one, make physical activity an integral routine part, and that means you have to design places that welcome and entice people to want to be physically active. Met extensively, I was on the board of directors of both the American Institute of Architects and very close to the developers of new housing, saying you've got to stop building just for return on investment and start building for health. And this was their touchstone, saying that put people first when you build, and physical activity needs to be embraced. It's not an amenity, it is a necessity in people's lives. Eventually, we got the entire Health and Human Services Department of the United States government and the Surgeon General to embrace designing walkable, healthy communities. And by the way, there are huge side benefits to climate: smaller fossil fuel use, smaller carbon footprint by designing communities that are much more walkable. A very important group to reach out to are the transportation engineers, the people that design roadways and the rest. They do know a lot about safety, but their awareness of how important they are to health has been much more limited. And so this is kind of inside baseball. What this is about is that the promotions of mid-level people in our transportation department in California, for example, they're asked directly, what have you done to promote health, not just safety, not just speed of transport? So I'll close with something closer to home from my work in Los Angeles, which is the Los Angeles River. LA was built in parts because of the Los Angeles River. The river recharged the groundwater, but there was flooding in the 1930s, so it was decided it would be turned into a concrete sluice. The problem here is the water then rushes out to the ocean with all its pollution. No benefit is really derived from it. And then it was totally inaccessible to the public. It was not turned into parkland as it should have been. And there were no bike routes to enable people to get downtown. There is no parks or recreation areas. This is the area with the worst levels of obesity and the most challenging levels of poverty in the LA region. And so getting LA, the 56 miles of the LA River, to be returned so it will be cooler, it will bring more groundwater recharge, but also wildlife and physical activity and exercise and green space to the people who are living there. It's a big project, it'll be over $50 billion over the years, but the city has embraced it and has been moving forward. And so sometimes you have to retrofit it. It should have been done 100 years ago, but it did not happen. So the last group I've worked hard on is to get the Institute of Medicine, it's now called the National Academy of Medicine, to put climate and human health on a par with something like COVID, the pandemic, which is a big step forward. And so Andy Haynes, the London School, was our keynote speaker at the meeting that I moderated on this. We had 50,000 attendees, and we're working hard to change the thrust and agenda of the medical establishment of the United States to care about much more the issue of climate and health. So with that, I will stop. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the Q&A. I hope I did not go over time by too much. Thank you so much.
Non-traditional populations, in particular children, how can they be used to engage the voice of children, which is so profoundly important in this issue?
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you, Richard, for that wonderful talk as well. It's a very tricky thing because journals are, ostensibly mainly addressed to, in the case of medical journals, to clinicians, and we don't address directly our patients, but we do have scope for being a public voice. At the BMJ, we have patients who write for us or review for us or co-author articles because we feel it's important that their voice gets through to our audience being doctors. So I guess I would say that if you're a child health journal or a pediatrics journal, really great to get children writing and also interviewing children or just getting their voice in the journal so that voice can be magnified out to your audience of clinicians. That's the way we're trying to do it on the BMJ. I hope that's an answer of sorts.
Thank you. This goes to Dick Jackson. What happens if physicians' worthy recommendations have no impact on those in power? What action should be taken if our voice isn't heard?
I guarantee you that you will have no impact on power the first, second, and third time you do it. And you just have to stay at it. And this is why I kind of devolved, if you will, to the stories, because every politician is hungry for stories. I've told them stories that they then turn around and pretend that they were the ones that experienced the same thing. So putting it in language that they understand, putting it in ways that are emotionally salient is very important. I dropped that little line in there about children not being little adults. Every pediatrician knows that, but it was a big transition when the regulators started using that very same line, that the child is not a little adult. We have to regulate to protect the child. And by the way, if we regulate to protect children, whether it's chemicals or lead or anything else, we're actually protecting everyone else, number one. Number two, you have to persevere and you have to have friends. And oftentimes the language we use in our first meetings is not very effective. And you learn as you go through, oh, this really sticks. I will say that my CDC experience is and Ruth Etzel knows as well, we were kind of preempted from talking to the media, and I have no regrets that I completely disobeyed that rule and got messages out to the media every chance I got, even to the point of getting some friends hire a lobbyist for public health in the process. And pediatricians are very good. When I was early in my career, the Academy knew who the pediatricians were, caring for virtually the family of every member of Congress. And that personal connection really counts for a lot.
Great. Thank you. Next goes to Fiona. How do journals influence medical education and other training programs beyond just the publication of manuscripts?
Okay, well, I mean, I think that, I think one of the things that journals can do is advocate for different ways of educating people. And I mentioned that we have patients writing for us, and we're very clear that that's one way to change the way education feels and is recognize that patients have a really important role in educating clinicians. In relation to climate change, one of the things we have taken on is twofold. One is to some extent teach doctors about climate change. We've had actual articles from climate scientists which because it's just another route to get the messages through. And it feels like if it's coming from the BMJ, they might think, well, this is important to me as a doctor. And we've also been working on sort of education about climate, advocating for that going into the medical curriculum, so that people, so that young doctors coming through feel that it's their right and their role to be part of this discussion, which they do anyway, but that's another route. And then we're looking at ways of educating, or rather informing doctors about and other health professionals about how they can change their practice, specifically in ways that will reduce carbon and other forms of environmental pollution. So this gets back to that detailed thing about, how can endoscopists reduce the number of endoscopies and the carbon footprint of each endoscopy? What about renal physicians with dialysis? What about anaesthetists with gases? So we're going to try to do more of that kind of practical education, which can show people that there are steps they can take within their clinical practice, which won't put patients at risk, which in fact may help patients, especially if you do it in a way that's empowering patients by including them in the conversations about their care. And many patients want to reduce the environmental impact of the care that they're receiving, even to the extent of saying, I don't need this care, this is not essential, and I would rather go without it. Because the balance of benefits and harms is not clear to me. And if it's going to be less environmentally damaging not to have this care, I would rather do that. So the patients have a very important role in empowering doctors in that sense. So I suppose everything I've talked about is about publishing articles, but what we hope is that the impact of those articles isn't just to the individual clinician for their CPD points, but that it is actually broader and could end up making a difference to the way care is delivered.
Great, thank you. This question is actually for both.
Can I jump in real quick, Jeff?
Absolutely.
That last question. It is very important that we develop a pipeline of future leaders, physician and health and pediatric leaders on climate and health. NIH has had a $40 billion a year, National Institutes of Health in the United States has had a $40 billion a year budget for almost 20 years, if you average it all out. They have spent less than 0.07% on climate and health. And if a young 32-year-old, well-trained person, and I know these folks from UCLA, wanted to pursue a career going deep into climate and health on children and other members of society, they cannot get funded. We are not developing the leaders adequately. And this is very serious. You're more likely to get funding for studying one mast cell function in the lung than you are to study a threat that's going to perhaps lead to 500 million refugees globally. And I think there's been real negligence in the health leadership of my country.
Let me just comment briefly on that as well. That issue also expands to the practice of social pediatrics, particular in, across the board. The UK, has a context for social pediatrics. The US doesn't, and many other countries don't. So a young pediatrician or another type of physician who wants to address the issues, as an example, related to climate change, violence, or whatever, the social determinants of health, has no way actually of doing that in the current practice environment. They can take care of ear infections, but they can't take care of issues related to climate change and other social determinants of health. So let me bring up an issue that has come up before, and that is in the context, and this is for both of you. We pediatricians and physicians in general, the opportunity to fly all over the world for medical conferences and other meetings. And how do we begin to restructure? That so that we're not we're reducing our carbon footprint as it relates to conferences and so on. Dick, do you want to start? And then Fiona, if you could comment on that as well, in particular as it relates to the role of journalism.
The National Academy of Medicine
holds an annual meeting in October. The last one was a virtual meeting. Normally they'd get 1,000 to 2,000, sometimes 3,000 physicians to show up. And the last meeting, which by the way, 1/3 of it was on climate, we had 50,000 attendees. And it was because it was a virtual meeting. And it had much more ability to change the trajectory of medicine. We had the heads of the medical school associations, the hospital associations, and others coming into this. So I think that COVID, one of the odd gifts of it all is going to be that it's changed travel. I think we all still need to travel to be around for weddings and funerals and important life events, but I'm not sure we need to be flying all over the place to pound our chests and talk about how important we are.
Well, now you're crossing a line.
Okay, sorry about that.
Fiona?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree. I medical conferences were always a rather odd way of sharing knowledge, and a lot of it was the finances of those, and that includes, the organization I work for, that people making, there's money to be made in medical conferences, and I fear that there's less money to be made from us meeting by Zoom. But back in that article that I mentioned, the one that seemed to cause so much annoyance back in 2006, a lot of it was about how we just need to stop flying around the world, and medical conferences need to change. And so here we are, 15 years later, COVID has changed everything. We've suddenly the whole, this seems entirely normal now, having a conversation like this with lots of people. It doesn't replace face-to-face. We will miss that. And I think for younger people who don't have yet the networks that some of us have built up because we've met up face to face. But I absolutely agree in the comment that Mark Hayden has made in the chat, pediatricians shouldn't fly. I think clinicians shouldn't fly. And speaking for myself, that's something that now becomes obvious if it wasn't obvious before. And I think there's a lot of benefits from meeting like this. It's a very different thing to do. I think the business models may mean that we bound back into the way we were, and that's something we need to resist as clinicians. We need to fight back and say, no, we don't need to get on a plane, and the money won't make us.
Jeff, can I supplement something Fiona had said? Because this issue of being attacked because you're saying something that is disagreeable to the pharmaceutical industry or the petroleum industry or the home builders or something else, it's one of the reasons that we pediatricians need to stick together and be supportive of each other, because it's very hard to take this kind of beating by yourself. And I mentioned Herb Edelman and the lead story. That poor man was beaten up for years by the lead industry, and they seconded all of his papers from his office. It was a terrible time. He eventually succeeded, but we need to take care of each other when we get into if we're doing the right thing for children and now and children of the future.
Great. Well, it's Fiona, what you had brought up about the economics of large meetings. It's not a secret that if you go to in particular the Academy of Pediatrics meetings, but in going to meetings all over the world, which I will stop doing in the future, it's clear the pharmaceutical industry and formula industry and so on are the main generators of income for multiple large professional organizations, and they rely on them to sustain their organizations, and they rely on people traveling to those sites in order to sustain it. So it seems that the leadership in medicine, not the least of which is from journals to organizations and so on and so forth, need to come up with a different business plan in order to be able to sustain the professional organizations that, frankly, if we're built on virtual conferencing, may not need the same amount of money in order to be able to sustain themselves. But I mean, it's a critical issue that I don't know that I've been privy to people addressing. If Fiona, in your world, and Richard, in your world, are you seeing this dialogue and discussion? Are you hearing this dialogue and discussion? Fiona? You
mean with the pharmaceutical industry or with the society and their finances?
I mean in amongst professional organizations who will now, require, if there aren't conferences, in-person conferences, in which they generate huge sums of money from business and industry coming to present their wares to the participants, if that's not available to them in the future, who's talking about what alternative business models there are to, in some ways, support the industry, the medical industry, or the medical professional industry?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is a period of enormous change, and in publishing, we had open access. The BMJ's been a terrific supporter of that from the outset, and publishers have had to change their ways. And I think medical societies and others who run big conferences, which include my organisation, are having to confront this. And some will fail, some will fall, some will collapse. Others will survive. The ones that can innovate and provide material that people really want to access. The new group that I mentioned, Aim High, at the end of my talk, it is an interesting business model. They're not for profit. They are charge a small amount. I think that's the kind of way that this might work, is that, you know, webinars like this, if they needed funding and didn't have any other route to it and didn't want to take sponsorship money, people might well be willing to pay small amounts to join a conference like this. And if, as Dick says, you're talking about 50,000 people instead of just 2,000 people, then you can maybe find business models that will work. But I think it's going to be a fascinating time, and we've all got to embrace that. And you know, the impact on the environment has to be front and central. I do think I should just fess up to one thing that we have to face up to for the BMJ. We have a print journal that goes out every week to 120,000 doctors in the UK. We've done our very best to get it slim, to get it on recycled paper, to wrap it in paper, you know, to really try to reduce its environmental impact. But we can't get away from the fact that it's one of our major bits of our carbon footprint. And, you know, we're looking at ways of shifting the advertisers over, because that's where the revenue is for the journal. The advertisers need to move over online. With COVID, the pandemic, the advertisers, the pharmaceutical industries are moving much more online, and I think that's a very positive step. And I think we've been predicting the death of print for many years, but I think it'll be the environmental factors that will bring that about.
Great.
I just quickly mentioned that in the United States, the headline this morning was that the Senate and the House have kind of agreed on $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And where I'm going with that is, I was head of the center after September 11th at CDC, and had we had to pull together the National Pharmaceutical Stockpile and many such things. It was very easy to get funding for stuff, for things, for machines that politicians can stand next to and pound their chests. But the real infrastructure, the human infrastructure, is not supported. And if you really want change, you have got to fund that human infrastructure. You've got to fund the pipeline. Howie Frumkin and I have argued strongly that NIH needs a full Institute for Climate Change and Health, probably in the range of $1 billion a year. And we could be developed. We ought to have 3 or 4 experts on climate and health, including one that would be climate and children's health, at every single medical center in the United States. That's how you'll get them to change. It's not simply directives from on high.
Great. Well, I'm going to make an executive decision to move on to the breakout sessions, because we do want to be respectful of people's time and give them the time to talk together. I can't thank the two of you enough. You've continued the excellent presentations that we've had in the past, and again, we'll be archiving this work and trying to collate it so that we can pull out the critical issues that need to be addressed and presented globally. Again, I want to thank everybody who's participating and who's registered. And in particular, thank our two presenters. So